physically, but Maria Garda is joining us online. And we've shared the link to the presentation. Okay, we've shared the link to the presentation, to the file on Discord, so you can use the presentation however you like. You can also share the link outside, or you can tweet about the presentation or anything. It's all fine. So that's about the technicalities. And our starting point is that history is hugely important in the Polish public sphere, especially over the last 15 or 20 years. And although this slide was written before the workshop, when we talked with Marisa a bit earlier today, I thought that it's a nice contrast between the Slovenian case and the Polish case. So in the Polish case, history is very, very significant in public life in generally. And so this also seems to be reflected in Polish historical games, which not only concern history, but also often Polish history, national history specifically. The other point is that game studies in Poland seems to be quite internationalized. We have had quite a few international conferences in Poland over the last several years, but we have looked to the West much more than to our own region. And this is visible on different levels in historical games, in game studies, and game history. So we believe that this workshop is much needed also for Poland, and we're looking for a great discussion. And that's all from me from the introduction. And now I'll be giving the floor to Michał and Aleksandra.
I'm inviting you to a speed run through 1,000 years of Polish history in a few minutes. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah, the right answer is we were born ready. So let's go. First, the early medieval period, so pagan Slavs and early years after the baptism of Poland in 1966. We have two major video games that are fondly remembered from the 1990s. One of them was called Polanie. It was a single-player RTS, like Polish Warcraft. You are controlling a young leader of Polans, Polish Slavs, into building an empire, and this game had a second edition in 2003. And the other major title is actually a series of games based on Kajko i Kokosz comic books by Janusz Christa. Actually, Christa himself drew pictures for some of these video games. So mechanically, they were simple point-and-click adventures, mostly still fondly remembered. Now, the common view in the 1990s in games and in all narrative media was that Polish culture, Polish history, Slavic folklore doesn't sell. Like nobody in the West, nobody on the global market would be interested in Polish history. This changed rapidly and dramatically with The Witcher 3. Suddenly, people understood or discovered that Slavic folklore sells. This had two effects, actually. These were two breakthroughs. First of all, Slavic themes entered proudly the market. So you can see a few of these games, Eventide, it was a hidden object puzzle adventure, Slavic myths in the modern world. We also had Thea, the Awakening, and Thea, the Shattering, turn-based strategy in a Slavic fantasy world. We also have Ancestors Legacy. This one is a historical RTS which starts in the 8th century and continues to the next period. Slavs are one of the two factions. The other effect, after the global success of Witcher 3, the authorities, the government and many institutions discovered video games as a powerful tool to promote Polish culture and history, which resulted in funding schemes when institutions support the creation of games, especially games about history and culture. So two interesting projects are coming. Dungeons of the Amber Griffin focus specifically on the local Kashubian folklore from the Baltic Sea, supported by the Ministry of Culture, created with a local museum. The End of the Sun, an RPG, again, Slavic world, is based on photogrammetry of actual wooden houses in open-air museums. And new interesting Slavic theme projects are Blacktail Witchcraft Fantasy, Covenant Fantasy Strategy. These are not probably supported by the government, at least I don't know about it. We also have a tabletop RPGs, 3 tabletop RPGs in Fantasy Slavia. We have a few board and card games, and please note the dates. The board and card games and the last tabletop RPG Słowianie are after the success of Witcher 3, so this also has impacted the non-digital games. When it comes to research, we have, well, one scholar that published one paper in English. It's Tomasz Mochocki, and he researches Slavic heritage and politicization. The other name that specializes in game studies in comparison with history is Michał Sołtysiak, an archaeologist, but he publishes only in Polish. And still he focuses more on the Vikings than Slavs. That's as far as we went with research. Second period, the medieval kingdom of Poland has 3 games about Polish history released in Poland. Krzyżacy, the Teutons, about military strategy, the Poles against the Teutonic Knights. Ancestors' Legacy, which I also mentioned in the previous period because it goes across early medieval and full medieval times. We also have a Polish version of the Russian Reign Conflict of Nations, which is about warring factions, 26 nations, Poland is one of them. In Polish, it was marketed to the Polish player as one of the games when you can play Poland, you can play in Poland. However, we have quite a few. It's not the exhaustive list, there are more of those. We have quite a few games made in Poland about medieval history, medieval Europe, but they are not focused on Poland. So we have Medieval Dynasty, which is like a general Europe life sim in the Middle Ages. We have Rustler, which is Grand Theft Horse, medieval thug, stealing horses, stealing cards, doing crime. And the Manor Lords coming soon at RTS, they are not specifically set in Polish. An interesting case is Waterworks, construction management simulation of medieval town, Waterworks, created by an archaeologist supported by Ministry of Science, used in education at the University of Gdańsk. So it's an interesting case of a medieval local history in a video game. Witcher 3 can be mentioned because it's Kingdom of Redania, especially in the game lore, maybe less so in the game itself, but in the game lore it is heavily connected to medieval Kingdom of Poland as a counterpart. Non-digital games. We have small tactical and strategy games about wars with the Teutonic Order, mostly. Some of them are simplistic, cheap merchandise released for the 600th anniversary. Research, none whatsoever. Like, we haven't found research written in Poland about Polish video games, about Polish history. The closest match would be research by Polish scholars on foreign games which feature Poland, such as Crusader Kings 2, Medieval 2, Total War, Age of Empires. So Poland appears as one of the many medieval factions. One of them in a sense, and these games are researched by Polish scholars, but still they don't focus on Poland. So this interest is marginal, not central. And the last big period I want to comment on, the PLC, Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, when the Kingdom of Poland merged with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to form one state. We have quite a few games. 3 of them were released non-commercially. Szlak Sobieskiego and Skarb Sobieskiego are games funded by local counties, like 5 local counties on the border between Poland and Ukraine on the Polish side. They wanted to promote local culture, local heritage, attract tourism. So it was an interesting case of a small regional administrative units supporting game production. And the other, maybe even more interesting in terms of who pays for these games, is the Crown of the Commonwealth, Korona Rzeczypospolitej, founded by an NGO, which is a foundation of the Prince Lubomirski bloodline, an actual aristocratic family which has this genealogical connection to the PLC period. Now, Hellish Court, it's a fencing simulator with the saber. We have several versions of mods to Mountain Blade. Some of these were created by the community, non-commercially. And then we have Fire and Sword, which was produced by a Ukrainian studio. And it was released in Poland with special focus on Poland. Originally, it has 5 factions. Poland is just one of those. Its Polish edition was about playing the Polish noble, about leading the winged hussars, etc. We also have a game called Beast with yours truly as the game writer, a turn-based tactical and grimdark version of the 1590s, but it's still secretive. Non-digital games. In GK Pola, The Wild Plains, Wild Fields was a tabletop RPG, the only one set in this period. Vito was a collectible card game set in the same period. And we have a miniature war game called By Fire and Sword, plus a few board games, including Boże Igrzysko, its Polish version of God's Playground. This game is available on the international market. So my speedrun is over at this point. Now it's time to slow down a little bit. But there's a special case in this period when role-playing set in the PLC extended to sustained involvement in other heritage practice and other gaming. And this goes over to Aleksandra.
Okay, so it's my turn now. So, okay, very briefly, as you can see, okay, GK Pola is an interesting, phenomenon from the point of view of fun studies and fun involvement, because they appear to be very productive. They has been very productive in terms of related works, like works that were created because of people interacting with the game, and they like that system also contributed to huge community kind of development. So in terms of fun studies, people really wanted to have more of the game and more about the game. And it was also reflected in some changes to the game, like in the second edition of GK Pola, we can find much more representation than in the first edition. For example, characters playable for females were developed and introduced, and also some attempt at, differentiating the ethnicity of the people, like, featured, the characters featured. So there was like a huge community of people creating LARPs, participating in LARPs, and writing scenarios and contributing with articles and research on, for example, the equipment that could be used in game. And that community later on developed into people actively engaged in either game development or different NGOs that use games for, disseminating knowledge about the period. And there is one case in point that I want to mention, and that's that Pospolite Ruszenie Szlachty Ziemi Krakowskiej and Projekt Rekreator. And this is an NGO specializing in historical and civic education via LARPs, RPGs, board games, and related stuff. And that's just like one example, because, okay, I could mention another one, for example, just like, Topory, another NGO that have published ready-to-use RPG scenarios, again, used to educate people in history. But this special NGO, Pospolite Ruszenie Szlachty, specific NGO, sorry, Pospolite Ruszenie Szlachty Ziemi Krakowskiej, I have mentioned, was involved in Projekt Democracy, and it was like a very interesting project to it went parallel ways, because it was meant to teach school students about democracy and democratic processes, and at the same time to teach them something about Polish history. So the idea was that they actually voted and created the voting system reminiscent of the 17th century Polish parliamentary system, and it was meant to be much more safer than teaching them about actual political parties operating on the scene at that moment. Okay, so they voted for their representatives as if in the Polish parliamentary system for the noble people in the 17th century. But parallelly, okay, they was like about teaching them that voting can give them some agency and influence, but that it was also involved in with teaching them about the history. And the most recent project developed by Pospolite Ruszenie Szlachty Ziemi Krakowskiej jest My Razem, and it's like a project, like, you know, to teach people about some, you know, connections and, you know, positive relationships between Poland and Ukraine. And it features, among the other things, like, you know, short kind of texts available on social media, including the Instagram, for example. So again, to run this up, okay, there are other projects, like, let me just mention one another, like, you know, labs from Krei Show at Nihilo, that are like a series of LARP games about 1940s in Wrocław or Breslau. Okay, so like some featuring really, you know, dark stuff about the Nazi occupation or Nazi activities. But again, like the one you can see on the screen, mentioned on the screen, was like, I think, the most productive community building wise and the biggest. It has not been documented well enough yet, okay, which is a pity, but I think that there is a lot to do about that, specifically from the point of view of fun studies and transmedia storytelling. So that's for me.
So to wrap up the speedrun research, this period in games is relatively well researched, as opposed to the medieval periods. So I have been researching the PLC period for a long time. There's also a few studies from other scholars. There is also a grant-funded research project I'm currently running with two colleagues at my university about historical settings as transmedia story worlds. And in this project, we are researching the American Old West and the Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian, Ukrainian PLC as two cases. So to sum up, the three periods. Period one, pagan, Slavic, and early Poland. Video games were relatively unpopular before 2015, and we get a sudden boost with Witcher 3 from 2015. Analog game also relatively unpopular in tabletop RPG, and rising after 2015 in board games. The main themes in the Slavic in games about the Slavic is Slavic mythology, folklore, and magic. They are not historical games. They are usually Slavic fantasy. Research, this period is under research in Polish game studies. Basically, Tomasz Majkowski is the only writer who publishes internationally on that. So potential research, I expect it to develop because of the rising trend of the on the market. So research has to keep up with this at some point. Medieval Poland between 11th and 16th century tends to make games about general European medieval history, not so much focused on Poland. When it comes to analog games, this is dominated by small-scale strategy, tactical games, some of them particularly cheap merchandise. When you just put Teutons, Poles as two warring sides, simple rules. The main theme is military warfare, and these games tend to be historical, not mythological. So there is a different trend. We found no research. The PLC period, the games are relatively popular in the 2010s, including non-commercial projects. Analog games have a noticeable continuity from the tabletop RPG. In itself, it wasn't a huge market success. It wasn't a great number of players, but people involved in this community continued involvement and became leaders of various heritage projects in gaming and outside gaming. So all people Aleksandra mentioned in this Pospolite Ruszenie NGO are former Dzikie Pola players. And it is a well-researched period. In addition to myself, we have papers by Majkowski, Majewski, Wrona, Szeja, Łopatecki, some of those in Polish. Two grants funded by Polish National Science Center. Mine, which I mentioned. There is also a grant led by Tomasz Majkowski on Polish video games in national context. So the PLC period is also definitely going to appear there. Thank you.
So hello again. We're here. Okay, that's good. And so we can have hex and counter simulational war games, but also there is a second, let's say, a design and publishing trend, which I call identity building or educational games that usually aim for a bit of a wider audience, because hex and counter war games are rather niche, complicated games, and those are and the second group uses usually simpler conventions, allows more players to play, so it's more of a family oriented in a way, and also we can see more of a cooperative designs rather than pure one-on-one conflict as in war games, and it is mostly because it would be a bit problematic for those identity building patriotic games to allow players to fight as enemies of Poland. So, for instance, as Nazi forces or of Russian oppressors or any kind of enemy of Poland. Then we have yes, there are also games that are focused more on everyday life during a certain historical period, or some kind of, let's say, lighter conflicts. So not wars, but for instance, strikes against the communist rule. Yes, the communist period is most prominent in this group. And there's also a bunch of very simple educational games. So basically quizzes, trivia, memory games, pertaining to let's say Polish symbols, Polish history, and so on. I don't focus on this that much because the game design is not really interesting, let's say, and also not really connected to let's say the gaming culture as we or. Maybe no, I'm retracting now, but let's just say I'm not focusing on those for now at least. So the first period, so the period of partitions. So in the late 18th century, what was known before as Poland or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was basically divided into divided by three other countries, so Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and Poland as a state ceased to exist until the end of World War I. But of course, there were many acts of resistance, and Polish culture was, let's say, being preserved and cultivated to certain extents during this time. And there are several war games, these tabletop war games depicting this period, and mostly the three anti-Russian uprisings from the 19th century. And there is one digital game about the January uprising. So this is actually a mobile game, best played on tablet, but you can also try on your mobile phone. And there are also several of these identity building titles, but these are mostly related to the events, let's say, around the 1918. So the time of regaining independence after the World War I, and these are mostly focused on this strongly, let's say, patriotic / nationalist discourses. So the, let's say, the national Polish identity is the, let's say, the most important in these ones. There are two, I would say, outliers from games pertaining to this period. The first is a Revolution 1905, which depicts workers' strikes that were part of a larger revolution in the Russian Empire at the time. And what's kind of different about this one, it's that it's a really like a multi-faction description of the events, and there is also a rather negative depiction of the church and the nationalist faction, which is not common in let's say most of the other games. And the second outlier, let's say, from this period is the game Kraków Trade of Women, which is mostly which is definitely about suffragettes and women's rights activists from late 19th and early 20th century. And what's let's say untypical there is that there are several figures that are, let's say, revered as patriotic figures in local and Polish history, but they are kind of like the villains there because they were really, let's say, opposed to emancipation of women at the time. So these games are rare cases of exploring of class and gender at the time, and they attempt to depict identities that are, let's say, beyond the national. And they were both released by leftist NGOs, let's say, and which is, well, contrary to most of the other Polish tabletop games, which are released rather by, let's say, national level institutions. Coming back to the interwar period, and we have several games depicting the post-World War I period of border wars and establishing the borders with the neighboring nations or states that were also like emerging in the power vacuum after the collapse of both Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Perhaps the most interesting of this is Semper Fidelis, depicting the Battle of Lviv. So it's a Polish-Ukrainian war over the control of the today's Western Ukraine. This one is interesting because it kind of links both of those tendencies of like being it being a pretty hardcore and serious war game, but also because of its content, it kind of tries to depict Ukrainians and the Ukrainian side as not only like the comedic villains, kind of, but it tries to also depict, like, let's say, the specificity and let's say the legitimacy of their claims as well. Yes, the Polish Bolshevik War of 1920 is a particularly popular topic, and especially in the last years, because there was a centenary of the battle. Then many of those, like, several games were released, and also there was even a game jam devoted to digital games that was specifically devoted to Polish Bolshevik War, and it was also state sponsored. And so here, for instance, you have this is like an infinite, this kind of like endless runner game where you have the brave female soldier, and you have like this zombie-like Bolsheviks coming from the right, and you need to either shoot them or jump through them. It's available. I will post the link. It's quite funny. And there are also some games just depicting, let's say, the everyday life of the period. Here, more in the like higher middle class thing, but it is how it is. Then we go to World War II, which is, I would say, absolutely central to both Polish memory culture in general. So every, like, most of the commemoration practices and public discussions pertain to the cultural memory of World War II. And also, it seems to be the most popular topic of Polish historical games. There are dozens of war games. I will not go into details there. And there are really a lot of this identity building, let's say, new wave titles. There's a bunch of digital games from which let's say the more interesting ones are Enemy Front, which is an FPS, part of which is set during the Warsaw Uprising. There's this Warsaw game, which is basically Darkest Dungeon clone set during the Warsaw Uprising. It's also really interesting. Kind of like cartoonish, but also trying to depict like really tragic circumstances. Pretty interesting case. My Memory of Us, which is inspired, which is this like cartoonish platform inspired by the by the Warsaw Ghetto and the history of occupation and the Jewish persecution in Warsaw. And yes, many of those board games are published by state institutions, and most notably, how much time? Go ahead.
You have 10 minutes in total, so for the Polish case, so maybe you could try to squeeze in some parts.
But I have like 10 minutes, 10 minutes for the whole hour presentation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that should be doable.
5 to 7 minutes for Maria.
Yeah.
All right. So that would be doable still. The most important of these institutions is the Institute of National Remembrance, which is in general a very powerful institution. It also like controls the historical archives from the communist period. So for instance, the secret police archives, and also like tries to let's say this is the institution that tries to control the narrative about Polish history also abroad, which was especially visible in the so-called Holocaust law, kind of like a diplomatic conflict between Poland and pretty much the rest of the world, sometime in 2018, if I remember correctly. And these games usually focused on really like heroic history, also Polish contribution to Allied war struggle. The notions of victimhood are really explored very often, and contentious and controversial issues are not really touched upon. When we talk about the communist times in the games, these are mostly depicted by those family-oriented games, of which the Q, Kolejka, is, I think, the most influential one. It was very popular and translated into many languages as well. It basically depicts a situation of waiting in the queues for like undersupplied shops to get some deserved goods, and they try to operate kind of like both on opposition against the system and nostalgia towards the everyday life, everyday objects, and so on. It's a bit similar to this nostalgia phenomenon from the DDR period, so Eastern Germany. Very shortly. There is some research. Most of it focuses on individual games, and also there are some general texts that use examples from these games as examples of a potential of games for education and cultural heritage. My research focuses more on treating those games as discursive devices that try to propagate certain specific views on Polish history and identity, and try to universalize certain views. So I guess it will be all from me, and we could pass to Maria.
Okay, so my name is Maria Garda. I am Polish, and I currently work in Finland. So I work at the Center of Excellence in Game Cultural Studies at the University of Turku in Finland. I research game and media cultures, focusing on sustainability, which you can see in this project, and on questions of history, heritage, and preservation. And I think a project's kind of very relevant for everyone, I guess. Here is the COST network that I'm running on the grassroots of Digital Europe, so comparative study. So anyone who is interested in that, please follow up. And we are now starting this Polish Digital Games Heritage Project. And be very exciting, as there is not that much research in that area. So I don't research history in games, I research history of games. So basically, what I'm interested in is history of Polish computer games. I also study board games from 19th century, but this is more of a pet project. So basically, the history I look at starts in the late 50s with the first Polish digital machine and first games. Of course, the most interesting stuff starts in the 80s. The first Polish commercial game was, well, not really published to the extent they wanted in the West, Webmaster, but very interesting. And from the very first game, you can see this connection of Poland to the 8-bit Atari platform, which kind of defined the landscape for decades, really. So the kind of most important part of the historical narrative is the fall of the Iron Curtain. And in that sense, Poland kind of falls into the regional narrative described by Jarosz Felf in the context of former Czechoslovakia in the book Gaming the Iron Curtain. Patryk Wasiak did a lot of research and very good papers on the Polish context. And I think what is the most kind of important from the heritage and preservation perspective is the technological and cultural lag. So the long 1980s, for example. So when the, how you call them in English, computer sales, computer first were booming in Poland, and it was like the height of the 8-bit era. Basically already in Finland, for example, the retro gaming movement was starting. So the kind of timelines are different in Poland, and in most kind of Eastern European countries, it is similar. If you want to read more about it, there's this book, New Media Behind the Iron Curtain, that I have co-written with my colleagues. So in the 1990s, we had the first kind of signs of monumentalization of classic video games and hardware with papers and articles in popular magazines like on the left, and websites mostly focused on old hardware people started to collect, and kind of this internet hubs came to life. Then in the 2000s, you had first retro gaming groups and exhibitions. And the first one I uncovered was Electronic Entertainment, exhibition focused on one person's collection, presented at the Museum of the Apollyon Silesia, of all places, you know, just someone knows someone. In 2008, we have the first exhibition. And in 2010s, you could see this kind of move towards institutionalization. So you have a lot of associations coming into existence, focused on preservation of hardware, on retro gaming as a practice. And there is a certain kind of continuity here. So, for example, first, the association from Katowice was focused on the hardware, then they created this museum, which now is very established, and what they are presenting there are mostly really games. So this is the publicity kind of outreach they have. So mostly if you want to present old computers, you usually, as software, you don't present, you know, early spreadsheets, you present video games. And similar in Wrocław, it was the Retro Gaming Association, and now they have a museum, which was actually a successful crowdfunding campaign, which is interesting from institutional perspective as well. And this year we have a new association funded based on the Atari groups that were kind of growing, since I'm admitting someone to the room, that were growing really since the 1990s. And again, the Atari footprint is very strong, as it was a very prominent platform for a long time. So just some thoughts that I also shared during my keynote on SIX at the SIX conference in Tallinn last month on the present stage of game heritage in Poland. So we have very kind of limited and ad hoc collaboration between stakeholders. So you have these retro gaming groups, and then you have us academics, and you have different museums and institutions, like three most important groups of stakeholders that are not really collaborating, maybe occasionally, but this is not really established. For example, to extent it is in Finland, where
Maria?
you have this. Yes.
Sorry, maybe you could try to condense the rest of your presentation and to wrap it
It's my
up.
last slide, so
Yeah,
I think
great. Okay, thank
I'm
you.
finishing. Yes. So basically there is like limited collaboration, and I hope with the new projects that I mentioned, this will change. There is also limited recognition of video game heritage. Usually the kind of public discourse is focused on the profits of the game sector. So yeah, The Witcher is bringing so much money and we want to invest in new technologies. So the institutionalization or heritageization, if you want another difficult word, at early stages, mostly private museums, and no systematic research, but this is changing with the project that I'm in with Paweł Felik. Staszek is also in it, Tomasz Majkowski, Michał Filiciak, so the names you have heard before. And kind of a recent issue with the national history, politics, and preservation of communist era heritage that, of course, there's not that much interest in that, even though it was in the 80s, there were a lot of state funded initiatives like different hardware. So this is kind of maybe problematic, but I guess I don't have more time to dwell into it. So thank you very much.
There are some big team projects that have begun in recent years. Some of them have to do with game history, and I hope that this workshop will also help begin a new chapter in historical game studies in Poland, which might be then a little bit more focused on the region and not so much on the nation and on the West as has been the case so far. So thanks for bearing with us all. Thank you.
Thank you.